Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the next episode of the Java Basics series. Today we're going to talk about for loops, and a for loop is defined as a repetition statement that works well when you know how many times you want to execute the loop. And a for loop is a lot like a while loop. However, while loops are usually better to use when you don't exactly know how many times you want the loop to go through. Now, I'm going to write out a for loop. I'm going to write out all its parts and an example of a for loop, and then I'm going to explain each individual part after it's written, because that's the easiest way to do it. So I can say for int I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus. Now, this is an example of a for loop. This is just a standard for loop with numbers. No, you know, no complex stuff. Now, each for loop, and this goes for every single for loop. For loops will always have three parts in its header, and this is what I mean by the header, this part in the parentheses. It'll always have three parts that are separated by a semicolon. And the first part is the initialization, which is initializing a variable that you name, which could be anything. It could be I, it could be X, it could be C, it could be num, it could be anything, as long as the three variables agree. They can be the same thing, or they can be anything. So you initialize that variable to a number. It doesn't necessarily have to be 0, but in this case we're telling the computer, okay, this variable that we're starting with in this loop is going to be 0. We're going to start at 0. And the second part of the for loop is the Boolean condition. So when the computer runs the for loop, each time it loops through, it's asking itself, okay, is I less than 10? And if that's ever false, then it's going to kick out of the for loop. But as long as this Boolean condition is true, then the for loop is going to keep running through. Which brings me to the third part, which is the increment. And if you remember from the last video, incrementing a variable using plus plus, that just increments it by 1 each time. So we can come in here and say system.out.println, and then we can just say I. And that's just going to print out the number each time, because I is an integer that's equal to a number. It's currently equal to 0. So what this for loop is going to do, if you want to break down the different parts, if you want to get in the brain of the for loop, this is what it's thinking. It's saying, okay, I currently equals 0, and I, on the first run of the for loop, it does not check the Boolean condition. It's saying, or actually no, that's not what I mean. In the first run of the for loop, in which I is currently equal to 0, I is checking the Boolean condition, which is saying, is I less than 10? Is 0 less than 10? Yes. So it's going to print out I. And then it's going to increment here, and then it's now going to equal 1, and then it's going to say, is 1 less than 10? Yes. So it's going to print out 1. And it's basically just going to keep doing this over and over and over again. It's a lot like the while loop, but for loops can be used for a couple of different things. So having said that, it's going to go all the way up to 10, but not include 10, because it's less than 10 and not less than or equal to 10. So if I run this for loop, then what do you think will print out? I want you to think about it for a sec. And if you thought that 0 through 9 would be printed, then you are correct. And the reason why it printed out 0 through 9 is, one, because it started at 0, it printed out 0, and then it incremented. That's why 0 is involved. And then it did not print out 10 because it was going up to 10, but not including it because it's just less than. So, having said that, if I were to say this, if I were to put an equal sign there, then obviously we know, or I hope you know, that 10 would now be included. So if you thought that it would print 0 through 10, then you were correct. So if I come back down here, one thing I do want to say about for loops is that you don't always have to increment by 1. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the increment portion over here, every example in which I've used an increment, I've always incremented by 1. Well, you don't always have to do that. You can increment by 2, 3, 15, whatever, however much you want to increment by, whatever your code requires you to increment by, because you're not always going to increment by 1. So to increment by different numbers, we can say I plus equals, and then whatever number we want to increment by after it. So 2, if we want to do 2, 3, if we can do 15, we could do 50 for all we know. We could do any number we want. So for this example, we could say 2. Okay, and I'm going to take this equal sign off of 10. And this is going to be another example. I want you to think about what will be printed out in the console when I run this if I'm incrementing by 2 each time and not including 10 and starting at 0. What do you think will be printed out in the console if I run this? Now, let's see. If you thought that it would print out 0 through 10, the even numbers, not including 10, then you are correct. It did that because it first printed out 0, then it incremented to the number 2, and then it said is 2 less than 10? Yes, and it kept doing that over and over and over again until it got to 10. Is 10 less than 10? No. So it kicked out of the for loop and then continued on with any extra code. So that's obviously very basic, and we're not done. We're not quite done yet. I want to tell you that you don't always have to go forwards with for loops. Now, what do I mean by going forwards? Well, you don't always have to go from a smaller number to a bigger number, right? In this case, 0 to 10. You can go from 10 to 0. You can go from 100 to 0. You can go from 1,000,000 to 500,000, whatever. You don't always have to go from a smaller number to a bigger number. And to do that, to go from a bigger number to a smaller number, we have to switch these two. We have to switch what the initial number is, and let's say let's do 10 to 0. And whenever you do this, whenever you're going from a bigger number to a smaller number, you always have to switch the increments. Now, think about what would happen if I were to run this program just how it is without switching the increment. Well, actually, no, I take that back. It wouldn't even run because 10 is now less than 0. One other thing that you do have to switch is the sign that, like right where my cursor is. You have to switch this sign because 10 obviously is not less than 0, so the for loop's not even going to print out anything. So you have to switch that to a greater than. So if I were to run it just how it is, this is not correct. Just saying, this is not correct. If I were to run this for loop just how it is, what do you think would happen? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. You can pause the video if you want. So yeah, so I'll give you like three more seconds. Okay, so if you thought, or if you remembered from the while loop video, you remember me talking about an infinite loop. And in this case, it would be an infinite loop because 10 is greater than 0. And each time the for loop runs through itself, I is incrementing by 2, which is currently 10. So it's going to go 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. It's never going to reach 0. It's never, this Boolean condition is never going to be false because of this infinite loop. And to combat that, to make it so that this works going backwards, we have to say, if we wanted to go backwards by 2, we wouldn't say I plus equals 2, but we would say I minus equals 2. Or if we wanted to go down by 1, we would say I minus minus. Now, if I were to run this, what do you think would print out? I'm going to go ahead and run it. And I personally think that it's going to print out 10, the numbers 10 through 0, but not including 0. So it's going to print out 10 all the way to 1. And if you agreed with me, if you got the same thing, just go ahead and give yourself a pat on the back because you are correct. And yeah, that's pretty much it for for loops. They're pretty simple, and they're very handy in programs that involve running through sets of data and other things involving long lists, and can be a better option to use over while loops at times. So I hope that you have an understanding of for loops now and that you took something from this video, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.